Our next speaker, David, is also one of the people that presented a couple of times here at BruCON. So this time, he's going to entertain us with SAML single sign-ons and the pain and the fun that goes with it. So please give him a round of applause.
I thought I was going to be juggling for you guys. I'm supposed to speak? Okay. Everyone, thanks for having me again. This is my third BruCON, and so I'm excited to be back. So just a little bit about myself. So I'm David Mortman. I'm the Chief Security Architect at Dell Software, and I somehow convinced someone to also give me the title of Distinguished Engineer, which is impressive since I don't write code. But I also don't drive a train, or build bridges. So that's it. So the thing is, I'm going to talk today about identity, single sign-on, federation, the whole authorization, authentication space. And frankly, this is a sad story. There's no happy ending to this talk. I'm going to warn you now. There's no good news here. Well, maybe a little bit of good news. We'll see what happens as we go through this. But this really is a sad story. Things are kind of a cluster, identity. This is a huge problem out there. Really, I mean, it's hard. This is a hard problem to solve, and not only that, we're bad at it. I mean, we're really, really bad at it, in fact. You look at things like the Verizon reports. Every year that Verizon's done the DBIR, 6, 7 years in a row now? Every single year, one of the biggest vectors is identity. Default passwords, password reuse. Pretty much most of the major breaches that have happened for like restaurants and SMBs who are using point-of-sale terminals that are basically PCs or Macs. Every single one of those breaches is because a vendor who supplies these to the customers used the same password everywhere. So it's like taking candy from a toddler, really. Actually, it's easier than taking candy from a toddler. I have a 5-year-old who's a little bit older than a toddler. I don't get any of his Halloween candy. They're really protected. They hold on tighter to their candy than we hold on to passwords, honestly. So maybe we should have kids manage our passwords for us. Yeah. Well, the password's star, 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 star. But it's a huge problem. Like I said, we're really bad at managing passwords. When you start looking at, like I said, these breaches at point-of-sale terminals, they use the same password everywhere. So, and it's, by the way, it's of course, admin-level password. And then when the miscreants figure out what that is, they just scan the entire internet. And they find all the thousands of machines they can get into with the same root password. I mean, Chris alluded to this earlier in his opening talk. It's just don't use the same password everywhere, and don't store it in clear text. But the thing is, I'm getting ahead of myself, my slides. It's also really boring. Okay, so who here has to manage identity on a regular basis? Yeah, a reasonable number. Yeah, do you look forward to that? Do you say, what, I really want to do an identity management matrix today. That's what excites me. No, it's boring. It's really, really boring. And did I mention that we're bad at it? I mean, we really are bad at it. The thing is, this is not rocket science. Take the user, create them a password, create them a credential. When they change roles, adjust their authorization. When they leave the company, disable that password. But it turns out this is not complex. This is not complex. It's not even that complicated. But it is really, really hard. And that's the thing is that it's not rocket science. Anyone who's here at my keynote 2 years ago, I ranted a lot about how a lot of what we do in security is not rocket science. But it's boring. And I, for one, would much rather go home when I get home next week, start playing with all the new things that Amazon announced that are security related for its service. That's some cool stuff. There's config management, there's policy stuff, there's some really high level stuff that could make Amazon all the more secure. But the reality is I'm gonna spend a bunch of time talking with folks on the product teams about how to make identity easier to manage. And we'll all be bored. But because it's not exciting, it's not sexy, it doesn't generate good headlines. It certainly doesn't, get good press, even at things like the RSA conference, which is all about getting press releases out. And it's even boring even before you get to the authorization space, which is this whole different world easy. So like I said, it's basic, but it's not easy. Did I mention boring? Anyone know? Really, I mean, and once you get to the authorization space, it gets even more boring. Ooh, look, it's a big, n by n by n by n chart trying to figure out who gets the ability to do what. And I'll get more into the authorization stuff later. But I mean, when you think about some of the biggest breaches we've had, like the Societe Generale breach several years ago, a trader bounced back and forth between the front end, the front office and the back office, and he kept his access to both front end systems and the back end systems, so he could defraud the bank. He had the ability to cover his own tracks to the tune of something like $2 or $3 billion in trade fraud, because they didn't have basic, move, add, change as his role changed within a company. I mean, this should never have happened, except for the part where it's not the easiest task to do, and it actually gets exponentially harder every time you add an identity management endpoint. And it's not made any easier by the fact that, what we're still at? Passwords. Really, this is where we are. It's 2015. We've had passwords on our systems for 30, 40, 50 years, and the state of the art for most people is a password. 8 characters generally. Maybe if you're lucky, you can get down to 6. Amazon actually lets you do as few as 6, and there's no complexity requirements. They don't care. They want your money. It's worth it for them. But typically in an enterprise environment, you're 8 to 10 characters, numbers, characters, symbols, uppercase, lowercase, DNA sampling, retina prints, the name of your first girlfriend, boyfriend, dog, whatever. And then you have to change it every 30 to 60 days. Actually, where I work, every 60 days. It's a good thing I have a password manager that lets me generate random BS passwords, and I never have to type them anywhere, because otherwise I'd be doing the same thing everyone else does, which is a post-it note and changing the last digit or something on the password. Right? Okay. Honestly, who uses a password manager? Nice. I think that's the best response I've ever got to that at any security conference even. Thank you. You guys rock. Way to deal with that password problem. How are we doing? Okay, so, so then there's, MFA, 2-factor passwords, multi-factor. Good stuff, right? Yeah, mostly, except for a lot of people, it's still really hard. I mean, so secure ID. Did anyone have to use an actual physical secure ID token? Or a similar one, like where it changes every 60 days? Yeah, we got a few hands up still. Isn't that fun? Do you carry more than one? Yeah, I had one job where I had like 4 on a keychain. Wait, which one is it? This is not useful. Okay, yeah, there we go. Thank you. So, I mean, in principle, it's a great idea, but it's not really user-friendly. The last thing someone wants to do is constantly have this thing out. And this is one place where actually we've made some great progress. I love this. I have no affiliation with Google other than as a user. Google Authenticator is awesome. Anyone else use Google Authenticator? Yeah. It's great, isn't it? It's like really solves a lot of the problems, as long as you don't accidentally wipe your phone without a backup, in which case life becomes supremely painful to recover from. So I hope you all have saved somewhere that's not on your phone the printed out code so you can get back in to re-authenticate your phone for your authenticator. That's pretty cool. The other thing that I love in this space is the ability that Google's added to where you only have to do multi-factor authentication like once a month. I think that's a great compromise in terms of usability. The average user, okay, so once a month you have to pull the phone out and use that to get to Authenticator, copy out of an SMS. That seems like a nice compromise, right? It's not quite as tight or efficient as every time you log in that you have to use it, but it seems like a nice compromise. This is actually a really nice, I liked this actually. I'm a big fan of this solution. I've just started looking at FIDO. This looks pretty cool, I have to say. They just, GitHub just announced some integration with FIDO and YubiKeys. So you just tap your YubiKey and you authenticate to GitHub, all certificate-based and things like that. I haven't dug deep into that, but this looks promising from an individual user perspective for doing some nice, pretty secure multi-factor authentication. If we tie it into something like OAuth or SAML, really OAuth, this gives us some potential, long-run potential as individual consumers to solve some problems. But as I was saying, the general problem is that every time, especially for an organization, every time you add an identity management endpoint, someplace new where you have to manage users, the job of whoever's job it is to manage identity gets exponentially harder just looking at authentication. This means, one more place that you need to disable a user. excuse me. That's just one, like I said, one place to disable a user, another place to add a user, make changes, and whenever things happen. So we came along with, we said we need single sign-on. This way we centralize that username and password into a single place, single point of failure, single point of compromise, but ease of use for the users. So, this started with single sign-on 15 years ago at least. And we're still terrible at single sign-on. I mean, it's not that complicated. So I've deployed a few of these systems over the years. But even today, one of the clients I work with, you authenticate to the first app. And by the way, you go to the website. It's a third-party site that they've single sign enabled using I think ping, but it's actually irrelevant to whatever the vendor is. And what I get is an HTTP basic pop-up. 2015, I'm encouraging my users to type in an HTTP basic pop-up window. That's not exactly training people with the right incentive scheme. Oh yeah, sure, just type your password into a random box that popped up. You have no way to authenticate that it even came from the right space. And then when I go to the next app, I have to do it again. And if I VPN into the client, every time I hit a new web page, sometimes I have to do that again and again because it really has no concept of a non-Windows user, even though I'm authenticating. And I have an agent that's supposed to do that as well. So this still sucks. The single sign-on is a pain. And we started out, first we had these proprietary systems, SiteMinder. Everyone remember SiteMinder? Now a CA product. And then we had, IBM or someone, they have like WebSeal. There was Securant, which RSA owns now. There was a host of others, but basically they're all these proprietary protocols. And we said, yes, they sort of work as long as we are inside our enterprise using no third-party apps and you're on Windows and authenticated to the domain. It mostly kind of works as long as you're running IE6 Service Pack 2 with the following hotfixes, and it's a Tuesday and the moon is is waning or waxing depending on which configuration option you clicked on. And we said, you know what? Oh, also, everyone remember Microsoft Passport? Anyone? The old fart, apparently. It was Microsoft's attempt to do internet-based single sign-on, and everyone said, no, we don't trust you. We're not going to let you do that. And then a whole bunch of companies, including Sun and SGI, probably Dell and HP, I don't know who else, all said, we're going to come up with the Liberty Project for doing open source federation, and no one deployed that. Even, so that wasn't so hot. So we said, you know what, we need open source. We need, not open source necessarily, we need an open standard for a single sign-on. At that point, we're calling it federation, and we came up with WSFed. It's all XML-y. Did I hear someone say boo? Thank you. And it turned out that WSFed was heavily backed by Microsoft. And as a result of politics and whatnot, pretty much the only people who actually used WSFed was Microsoft and heavy Microsoft partners. So WSFed works, it works today. If you're a complete 100% Microsoft shop. It works pretty well for both single sign-on and federation. You authenticate against your Active Directory, either with your username and password or multi-factor authentication. It kind of does the job. But no one has a pure Microsoft shop today, and it doesn't really work with anything that's cloud-based because almost no one is actually running things on Microsoft in the cloud. So it doesn't work with your Salesforces or Workday or whoever you're using for your or Concur or any of your other sort of third-party cloud-based apps you'll be using. And soon after that, we got SAML. SAML's pretty cool. It's pretty secure. Lots of certificate-based authentication between components. Excuse me. SAML is its own little nightmare, however. Anyone here deployed SAML? Did you cry? Or at least want to? Because I certainly, the thing about SAML is, when I talk about SAML, there's actually more optional portions of the standard than there are required portions of the standard. When I look at SAML, I think of the old Tannenbaum quote about the wonderful great thing about standards is there's so many to choose from. That's pretty much the same case with options when you get into SAML. It's a complete nightmare. I have never seen an integration between two different SAML providers work without custom engineering. Not once. It's hard enough to make it work when it's all the same product. But as soon as you're trying to make, especially if it's one of the open source versions, talk to a commercial version, or even two commercial versions to talk to each other, they're all standards compliant, but they've chosen different options to support, different criteria to support. And most of them, actually, I've yet to see a single SAML provider that properly supports all the requirements, even. It's that complex. Most notably, what's usually missing is single logout. Because that's one thing that's missing from most single sign-on products, is the ability to log out of it. When you're single sign-on enabled, you click log out in your application, and all it really means is that you've quit out of that window. But if you go back to the product, you're re-authenticated automatically and you're back in. SAML actually requires that you have a single logout option, so you can either go to the IDP or even from within a single app, when you click logout, it should log you out of everything. As a result, in a lot of ways, no one's SAML compliant. And I was working with a product team, and I said, look, so we need single logout. And they said, what's that? And I'm like, you're the identity folks. You don't know what single logout is? And they said, hold on a second. I hear a lot of clicking in the background and some muttering. Went, oh, right. That is part of the standard required profiles, isn't it? I read that 8 years ago when I first learned about SAML. So it's just hard to make work together. It's a nightmare. I've had nightmares trying to deploy multiple SAML providers. It's not fun. I sort of jumped ahead of myself, so we'll get past the HTTP basic, but this happens a lot. Not just more with SAML than anything else. In fact, SAML is such a pain. So SAML has this concept of an identity provider. It's basically a proxy that sits between the app you're trying to authenticate to and your backend directory. It generally sits on the internet edge at your gateway or something like that, and it proxies the requests back and forth, so that way you get to the right directory and things like that. This is enough of a pain point for most companies that there's actually an entire market of people who are doing just hosted identity providers. It's just a proxy. It sits there on the internet and communicates back to your directory or whatever you're using for your backend authentication, to your MFA provider, whatever it happens to be. Simplified, they just got acquired by RSA. There's Okta. They're doing quite well. Microsoft has ADFS, which is basically an IDP provider that you can either get through Azure or you can host your own. But this is how problematic the space is, that we generated probably a $20 to $50 million market at least to handle as one little piece of it, because it's such a pain point that for enterprises, that's what we got going on. So that's kind of a problem. And then we have OAuth. Anyone else? OAuth. Who you see? The most likely place you've seen it is if you authenticate to anything from your phone. So Twitter, Facebook. Actually, I guess Facebook doesn't really do OAuth, but third-party clients like I use Tweetbot for Twitter. When you authenticate to Twitter, you're actually this app. You don't type your credentials into the app. It actually redirects you to Twitter's login page, and you authenticate there and say, I'm authorizing this device. And this is an important thing, is that OAuth is used as an authentication protocol, but technically it's an authorization protocol. You're basically telling an app, or either like a web app or a mobile app, that you have the ability, that you're now authorizing that device or that application to act on behalf of the user. So you're not really authenticating using OAuth, you're authorizing something. And that works reasonably well on an individual consumer basis. But still, this means that this does not do any good for organizations that have, it's really it's next generation OpenID. So really great, as an individual user, I can go, oh, hey, look, I can now authenticate. I can use Tweetbot instead of the default Twitter client, because the default Twitter client is awful. To add to the excitement, there's multiple versions of OAuth. There's OAuth v1, which has all sorts of delicious security features in it, including encryption and message signing and all this good stuff. And it was used by a few organizations. And then V2 came out. V2 made all the security features optional. And frankly, it took off like gangbusters. A lot more organizations started using it because it was a lot simpler to implement, it was less complicated. I think of this as the Betamax problem. I talked about this a few years ago when I was talking about the difference between REST and SOAP APIs. By all sort of reasonable definitions, V1 is the better protocol to use because it has all the security features there. You have to implement them, it does it the right way. trademark, copyright, et cetera, et cetera. It's kind of like Betamax. It was by any sort of standard definition the better product. But V2 is like VHS. It's easier to use. It's like REST. It's easier to use. It's very friendly. It's inexpensive in comparison. It's lower quality, but it meets enough of a need. It sort of meets the minimum viable product requirements for most people. So it got picked up. It was a lot easier to implement and deploy. So we have V2 instead. There is a V3. V3 has turned into a political nightmare. I think it's pretty much DOA at this point. Enough people who are in the core product are so pissed off at the direction of V3 that they've quit the project, and it's just kind of sitting there, and there's discussions of going straight to V4, but I'm not sure where things stand with that. I haven't really been following the political machinations there, but V2 is pragmatically where we're at. It has, like I said, there's no requirement for OAuth to use HTTPS. There's no message signing. There's not a lot of security there, so it's all up to the provider. Another downside, and I was talking to some folks earlier, I added this slide today because I was talking to a bunch of folks, and they said, you know what, OAuth is cool, but there's a whole lot of apps and sites I won't use because I'm not on Facebook. And if I want to use that application, I have to have a Facebook account, and I don't use Facebook. Or I don't want to give them access to my Google credentials. I got pointed at an app. Someone emailed me and said, hey, you should check out this cool new app on LinkedIn. I'm like, so I took a poke at it and it says, you need to authenticate, do an OAuth authentication against your LinkedIn account. I'm like, okay, well, the great thing about OAuth is it generally tells you what privileges, sort of like when you add a new app on Android, it says, here's the things it has access to. Well, OAuth gives you the ability to say that as well. So it says, okay, well, it can see your full profile. That's fine. Everyone can see my full profile, whether they're authenticated to LinkedIn or not. I don't care about that. And it's like, well, it can see all your first and secondary connections. I'm like, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Like, that's something usually I have to be logged in to sort of see some of my connections. And then it says, oh, and we want to be able to send email on your behalf as you, and read your email and respond to your email for you on your behalf. And I was like, fuck you. And hit the cancel button. But it's just like, no, I mean, it's sort of one thing to say you can authenticate against someone else's directory, and quite another to be like, let me impersonate you whenever I want. So this actually stops a lot of people from using some of these apps because they don't want necessarily to authenticate with those credentials or share that access back. Are we having fun yet? Because right now, I mean, this makes me, every time I think about this, it just makes me more nauseous than anything else. And what this does in this situation is also it tends to, you end up in another one of these phishing scenarios where if you get phished in pretty much any of these single sign-on environments with the passwords, you're really screwed because you just gave up access to everything. And frankly, in most corporate environments, it's not that big a deal because most of us don't have access to anything truly interesting in a corporate environment. I actually have no access to anything interesting in my current job, which is kind of cool. Certainly some people do. So of course I'm going to say, use multi-factor authentication because, at least that gives you some level of protection. So we're back to the sort of general problem space of how are you going to do that? What is your multi-factor going to be? Is it going to be FIDO? Is it going to be Secure ID? Is it going to be Google Authenticator? And some of these work better than others for enterprises. And so one of the things to sort of think, so I think one of the big differences between, if you want to really think about, when would I encounter SAML and that nightmare versus when I encounter OAuth, and it's a whole different nightmare, is that, SAML is pretty much an enterprise. It's an organizational level product. You're not going to see it as a typical user just running around doing things. You might. So like my bank is using SAML for some godforsaken reason. I have no idea why, because they only have one directory. But I suspect it's because they've outsourced a portion of the online banking stuff, so it's actually multiple customers hiding. But maybe not. And OAuth is really more of a consumer product. Excuse me. So that's where you're likely to encounter them. So depending on your use case and whether you're writing an application, a consumer app, or whether you're supporting enterprise or somewhere in between, you'll either see these in different places, or you'll have different nightmares depending on what your job is and how you have to manage these. So that's for sure. And then to add to the excitement, you have the whole authorization space. So authentication is bad enough. It's enough to make people ill. It's enough to make me tear my hair out. It causes nightmares. And it just sucks. I mean, this is a huge problem space. Then you get to authorization, and it's way, 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 way worse than authentication. By comparison, authentication is child's play. You create the user, give them credentials, they log in, life is good. Well, authorization's a lot worse, and it's worse for a lot of reasons. One is those ugly matrices, which I talked about at the beginning. Suddenly you need to figure out who can do what, when, where, and how. And it's not so bad when you have 50 users. You probably have 3 or 4 different things users might do. They might have developer, a sysadmin, salesperson, finance. You have a couple different roles. It's not so complicated. When I worked I used to be the CISO at CERTs. We had 5 applications. That's it. We had our own SQL instance. There was like email. There was, I almost said Salesforce. There was PeopleSoft, and there was the procurement system, and that's it. Not complicated. 5 total applications, and our roles and responsibilities matrices were a nightmare. It was Excel spreadsheet after Excel spreadsheet after Excel spreadsheet, mostly because PeopleSoft and SQL are so complex that the roles and responsibilities and things within them were complicated enough. But so with just 5 applications, trying to map who could do what, depending on their job role, we would update it yearly, and it usually took a couple of months to do right. The typical enterprise, and I shit you not, has between 5,000 and 10,000 applications when you're looking at the Fortune 500, the Forbes 2000. So try to imagine, just to figure out who can do what in those applications. And then to make matters worse, each of those applications has its own authorization system that's built in natively to the application. This is why I say this is hard. Because, you can have a full team of people whose only job 365 days a year is to track these things, and they'll still be falling behind. So people start saying, what we need is, we need a way of centralizing authorization. Let's get that authorization out of the applications. Let's get a centralized directory for authorization, much like we do with authentication. And the first steps were pretty good. They said, let's define group. You can grab groups of users on the basis of things like Active Directory LDAP. So then at least as users are created, you put them in the right groups, and that gets mapped to the appropriate roles within your application. That's a nice step, and that sort of makes it at least a little bit easier so when you can move a user out of that group and they lose those roles. But that doesn't really, that's an important incremental change, but it doesn't solve the general problem that you still are creating the policies and the rules in those individual applications. So along came XACML, because we weren't, thank you, XACML. This makes WS-Fed look cute and charming. It's XML based because XML is the future, right? Thank you. No, it's awful. It's so awful that we came out with JSON. Yes, it's that bad. But it's still, JSON's actually a lot better, but that's a different story. But XACML makes SAML look simple, getting it to work right. It's a complete nightmare. It has some good parts, though. It really introduced most of the identity world to the concept of attribute-based access control. And attributes are really cool. Let's do some really fun stuff. So one app that I really work with is a cloud thing, and it says only the person who owns a resource in the cloud provider can terminate that resource. Yeah. So it means that as a regular user in that group, I could reboot anyone else's EC2 instance. I can pause it, I can stop it, but I can't terminate it unless I'm the one who launched it. I think I probably shared this story at a previous talk, but I was working at an earlier company, and we were running everything on Amazon, and we didn't have an attributes-based access control system in place. And it's Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock my time, and I'm prepping for an upgrade in production, and I get an IM from one of our developers saying, I'm really, really sorry. What do you mean you're sorry? And he just responded back, I'm really, really sorry. Matthew, what did you do? He says, well, yeah, as a lead developer, I have full admin credentials to the development AWS account. I'm like, yeah, I know. I gave those to you. And he said, well, I was doing some testing, and I spun up some resources, and I terminated them, and I spun up some other ones, and I terminated them. And then I did it again, and I clicked on the machines, and I clicked terminate, and my boxes didn't go away. So I clicked on terminate a few more times, and the boxes were still there. And then suddenly Dan popped his head over my cube and said, I can't get to the main Oracle development database. And then someone else said, I can't get to it either. And it turned out that Matthew had accidentally terminated all of the development databases. Oops. Because we didn't have the ability at that time to do something like he could only terminate the boxes that he started. And so we canceled the production upgrade, and I spent the next several hours restoring the databases. Fortunately, there were good backups, but still, it was Oracle, which meant that even with a good backup, it was 4 or 5 hours to re-roll logs and all that stuff. And other folks I've talked to have basically implemented similar rules to prevent those sorts of accidents from happening. It's amazing how often those accidents happen when you have financial quotas in place for a group. Suddenly think, oh, David doesn't need those resources. I do. I'll just blow away what he started so that way I free up some cash for my project. It happens accidentally a lot, it turns out. People fat-finger things near the end of budget cycles a lot. This helps prevent that sort of thing, or similarly, just the ability to say, the attributes include things like source IP. Okay, I'm going to force anyone coming from this IP range to use multi-factor authentication because they never log in from there before. Or, you know what, they're coming in from, I'll pick on China because everyone picks on China. They may be in China, but let's just double check. So if they're coming in from the China IP address ranges, then they should authenticate again, but use multi-factor authentication. So attributes are really cool, and they go really, really well with role-based access control. So they make a nice combination of ability to say traditional RBAC, throw on some attributes on top of each other. But it turns out this is still a really hard problem. The typical organization who says they're using XACML lies. They're not. They're using the concepts of XACML, and they're generally doing a pretty standard key value store or a little mini JSON kind of thing. Almost no one actually uses XML, and no one's actually using the protocol. The standards are vile. They're unreadable. The samples are useless. One of these days, I'd be tempted to actually write something that was better, but no one actually uses XACML, so it sort of seems pointless. I could do more important things like drink more good Belgian beer. So XACML is kind of a mess. So just try to point out that all of the XACML committee chairs work for Oracle. We'll let people draw their own conclusions on the basis of that. I was almost an Oracle employee for 24 hours, which is a whole different story. Marianne loves me, by the way. But different story. I actually got her to fire me from Oracle before I got started. Ask me later about that one. So XACML, there's probably 100 enterprises, maybe 200 who are using some XACML-like thing. They're the ones who are sort of on the cutting edge of this stuff, and they're all doing basic key value stores, usually using JSON instead of XML because it's so much better. But again, they're basically doing the basic attribute thing, and they're using some sort of usually Active Directory or LDAP to store these things, and it's all for custom in-house built applications. So it's not going to help you if you have any sort of commercial off-the-shelf application. If you're using an Oracle or a Siebel or PeopleSoft, which are now all Oracle, or any other sort of commercial stuff like that. I've yet to find a SaaS provider that supports XACML. I've yet to find any sort of PaaS or IaaS vendor that supports XACML. So you can improve things if you have a lot of in-house applications, but it really is, again, it's an incremental improvement And like I said, I'm going a little fast here, but it's still a sad story. There is no happy ending. There's no happy ending in sight. I really don't have any advice for you even on how to make things better, other than try your best to get some sort of SAML thing working for your organization, and be willing to reallocate resources to those really basic things. This whole identity project is really, really boring, and no one wants to do it. I don't want to do it. I do it anyway. There was an internet meme about that, but we won't get into that. And the compliance folks don't drive it hard enough for anyone to really care. They say, oh good, you have your password changing requirements and you have some sort of central directory. And so until the incentive scheme changes to get us to change anything, nothing's going to change. The compliance regimes don't require us to do it. The executives at most companies don't make us change it. The CISOs don't have enough leverage to make anyone change it, and no one really wants to, so we're kind of screwed. And that's my sad, sad story for today. So thank you for coming out and listening to me rant. If you have any questions, I have a bit of time left, so let me know.
Are there any of these authorizations in place? So like, let's say, politics solved themselves and we did get OAuth 3 or 4. Is any of this like either attribute based access controls or authorizations showing up there?
So there is some authorizations, even in V2, there's the ability to sort of assign classes of users. So, typically for most organizations, you get there's sort of the read-only and read-write and sort of admin level sort of concept, which is the most granular most organizations get, like especially with most web-based apps. It's usually the choice is read-only or read-write, so it's the ability to sort of, can I pull or can I actually push things back as well? In principle, but with both SAML and OAuth, in principle, you can define attributes both in the sort of broad sense of this is what a user can do in a traditional RBAC sense, as well as an ABAC sense. They both have the concepts built in. They just are not well leveraged. Your typical organization who's using SAML is defining the authorization internally in its own things. And to the extent they're even using SAML for authorizations, they're just asserting what group the user should be in, as opposed to pre-populating that user with an Active Directory or LDAP sync or something like that. But all the authorization levels are still defined within the application, as opposed to defining it within the SAML query. But you could, in principle, do it. Basically, no one does. They're still too busy trying to make, the SAML provider talk to the IDP to talk to the database.
Hey, Dave.
Yes, Trey?
Hello.
Hey there.
You kind of glossed over the FIDO Alliance stuff. Could you speak a little bit more to that? Because that seems promising.
So yeah, FIDO is really interesting. Michael Barrett, who used to be the CISO at PayPal, was one of the people involved early on, as well as Paul Simmons, who is, for people who've been around for a while, was a founder of the Jericho project, which these days I guess we more call deperimeterization. It's really an idea to come up with a standardized multi-factor authentication approach that as much as possible is centralized, is user-focused, so it's certificate-based. It lets you do multi-factor. I haven't dug deep into FIDO yet. It does look promising at least as a consumer-based product. I have a pile of facts and things on my laptop I didn't get a chance to dig into yet. But that is, in terms of on the user-focused multi-factor authentication side of things, it looks really promising to have a fairly standardized process that will work across apps.
But that would potentially displace OAuth, but not address the enterprise use case.
Well, it's more of a replacement for usernames and for passwords as opposed to the authentication. It's an authentication fix. It's not an authorization fix. You would still need something. Generally, what you really see these days with OAuth is it's acting as a redirect from the app to the appropriate point at the backend directory provider. So like with Twitter, when you go to authorize an app, it redirects you to the actual Twitter login page. And then you do that there. OAuth sort of handles that, whatever, BO2, whatever the HTTP redirect would normally be. And then you would use username and password or multi-factor authentication, traditional multi-factor if you set it up with your phone for like a SMS-based auth, or FIDO if Twitter starts supporting it. Similar thing with GitHub. So like with GitHub, the idea is you no longer have you don't use your password, you just touch the YubiKey, and then it sends off the appropriate cert magic to make it happen.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, so just to summarize, to make sure I heard you correctly, the idea of, one thing about the idea behind FIDO is to let you do an assessment of the strength of your belief that a user is their user on the basis of their device, where they're coming from, some attribute-based stuff, as well as sort of say how they authenticated. Like it's something so it's a cert or a token or something like that. It's much more likely to be me or fingerprint as opposed to a 4-character password or 6-character password or something like that. Sound good? Thank you. Anything else? Okay, so just to make sure, what's my view on OpenID? I haven't looked, I haven't looked a whole lot at OpenID. In a lot of ways, OAuth sort of replaced OpenID. There's OpenID Connect, which is basically OAuth v2 with some magic on top of it. My main, I think it's fine. It works reasonably well in a consumer environment if you're savvy enough to, manage your own authentication systems. I think most people aren't, and they're just sort of asking for trouble. But that's sort of, we get back in the States, there was the whole recent issue where it came out that several officials at various levels over the years have been managing their own email servers, most notably Hillary Clinton recently, but it turns out most of the secretaries of state for the last 15 years had all their email and personal email servers they were managing themselves. And it's hard enough to manage email when you're deeply technically competent and you spend a lot of time on it. And I think that's, keeping his directory secure is sort of it's one of those magic things you don't want to break. You don't want to break DNS, you don't want to break BGP, and you don't want to break your directory server. Because those are sort of the three core legs that a secure internet experience relies on. Is am I who I say I am? Am I going to the right site? And is the routing actually legitimately bringing me there? So I think for most cases, OpenID is a nightmare waiting to happen for the typical user. Though I think that for some small corner cases, it makes sense. Well, thank you, everyone.